The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pentagon briefing room as General Morrison shuffled through his papers one final time. Today's meeting wasn't like the others. Today, they were discussing the most classified operation in recent military history, and sitting at the far end of the mahogany table was someone who had lived through it firsthand. Captain Sarah Chun sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, watching as senior officers filed into the room. At 28, she was easily the youngest person present, and the only woman among the dozen military personnel gathering for this debriefing. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her dress uniform bore the standard ribbons and insignia that told only part of her story. What the ribbons didn't show was the 3 months she had spent behind enemy lines in Afghanistan, operating under a call sign that had become legend among Special Operations Forces. What they didn't reveal was how she had single-handedly coordinated the extraction of 47 American hostages from a terrorist compound, or how her voice over the radio had been the last thing many wounded soldiers heard before rescue arrived. General Morrison cleared his throat as the last officer took his seat. The room fell into the kind of silence that only comes with military discipline and the weight of classified information. Outside, the bustle of the Pentagon continued, but inside this windowless room, time seemed suspended. The general had called this meeting to discuss lessons learned from Operation Desert Wind, a mission so sensitive that most of the people in this room were only now learning the full details. For months, they had heard whispers in the halls, fragments of stories that seemed too incredible to believe. There were rumors of a forward air controller who had operated alone in hostile territory for weeks, calling in precision strikes while evading capture by some of the most dangerous terrorist networks in the region. Captain Chun had been reluctant to attend this debriefing. She had submitted her written reports months ago, gone through the standard psychological evaluations, and completed her mandatory rest period. In her mind, Operation Desert Wind was finished, filed away with all the other missions that had shaped her military career. She preferred to let her actions speak through official channels rather than sitting in rooms full of senior officers who wanted to hear war stories. But General Morrison had been insistent. The military was evolving, he explained, and the tactics used in Desert Wind represented a new paradigm in special operations. Other units needed to understand what had worked, what hadn't, and, most importantly, how one person had managed to achieve what entire teams had failed to accomplish in similar circumstances. As the general opened his briefing folder, Captain Chun noticed the way some of the colonels and majors were looking at her. There was curiosity in their eyes, but also skepticism. She had grown accustomed to that look during her career. Being a woman in special operations meant constantly proving herself, constantly exceeding expectations just to be considered equal to her male counterparts. The mission had started like so many others, with intelligence reports indicating American civilians were being held by a terrorist cell operating out of a remote valley in eastern Afghanistan. The location was strategically important, situated along a major smuggling route that funneled weapons and fighters across the border. Previous attempts to infiltrate the area had failed, with conventional forces unable to navigate the complex network of caves and villages without alerting the terrorists to their presence. Captain Chun had volunteered for the mission when her commanding officer explained the unique requirements. They needed someone who could operate independently, someone with advanced forward air controller training, and someone who could blend into the local population if necessary. Her background in linguistics, combined with her special operations training, made her an ideal candidate for what everyone understood was essentially a suicide mission. The plan was straightforward in concept but terrifyingly complex in execution. Captain Chun would infiltrate the valley posing as a relief worker, establish contact with local resistance fighters who opposed the terrorist presence, and coordinate with air assets to eliminate the terrorist leadership while ensuring the safety of the hostages. She would have no backup, no extraction plan, and no direct communication with command for the duration of the operation. General Morrison looked up from his notes and studied the room. These were some of the most experienced military leaders in the country, men who had led troops through Iraq, Afghanistan, and countless other conflicts around the world. They had seen courage under fire, had made life and death decisions in the heat of battle, and had earned their positions through years of dedicated service. But What they were about to hear would challenge their understanding of what was possible in modern warfare. The general's eyes settled on Captain Chun, and she straightened slightly in her chair. She knew what was coming next. For months, she had avoided this moment, preferring to let the mission speak for itself through official reports and commendations. But now, facing a room full of senior officers who needed to understand the tactical innovations that had made Desert Wind successful, she realized that telling her story wasn't about personal recognition. It was about saving lives in future operations. The terrorist compound where the hostages were being held was unlike anything American forces had encountered before. Intelligence reports described a sophisticated network of underground tunnels connecting multiple buildings, with the entire complex protected by advanced surface-to-air missiles and early warning systems. Previous reconnaissance missions had been detected and repelled, with 2 aircraft shot down and their crews captured or killed. What made the situation even more complex was the presence of civilian populations in the surrounding area. The terrorists had deliberately chosen a location near several small villages, knowing that American forces would be reluctant to use heavy weapons that might result in civilian casualties. This tactical advantage had allowed them to operate with relative impunity, using the compound as a training facility and planning center for operations throughout the region. Captain Chun had spent weeks studying satellite imagery and intelligence reports before infiltrating the area. She memorized the layout of every building, the timing of guard rotations, and the daily routines of the civilian populations. Most importantly, she identified potential allies among the local resistance fighters who had been waging their own campaign against the terrorist presence. The infiltration itself had been accomplished through a method that would have seemed impossible to most special operations planners. Rather than attempting a high-tech insertion that might be detected by the terrorists' sophisticated surveillance equipment, Captain Chun had simply walked into the valley, carrying medical supplies and posing as a relief worker with one of the international aid organizations operating in the region. Her linguistic skills had been crucial during those first few days. Speaking fluent Pashto and Dari, she was able to establish credibility with local villagers who had grown suspicious of outsiders after years of conflict. More importantly, she was able to make contact with resistance fighters who provided her with detailed intelligence about the terrorist compound and its defenses. General Morrison paused in his mental review of the mission files and looked around the room again. The officers were listening intently, but he could see the questions forming in their minds. How had one person accomplished what entire units had failed to achieve? What tactics had she employed that were so different from standard special operations procedures? And, most importantly, how could these methods be adapted for use by other forces in similar situations? Captain Chun sensed the general's scrutiny and allowed herself a small smile. She remembered the moment when everything had changed during the mission, when she realized that conventional tactics weren't going to work and she would have to improvise using methods that weren't covered in any military manual. It was the moment when Sarah Chun, the by-the-book officer, had disappeared, and someone else had taken her place, someone the resistance fighters would come to know by a call sign that would echo through the mountains for months afterward. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. For the first week after infiltrating the valley, Captain Chun had followed standard procedures, gathering intelligence, and waiting for the right opportunity to strike. But, as days passed and she learned more about the terrorists' capabilities, she realized that a conventional operation would result in the deaths of most, if not all, of the hostages. The terrorists weren't just holding American civilians. They were using them as human shields while planning a series of coordinated attacks on American and coalition forces throughout the region. Intelligence gathered through her local contacts revealed that the hostages were being kept in the underground tunnel system, moved regularly to prevent any rescue attempts, and guarded by suicide bombers who had orders to kill them at the first sign of an assault. General Morrison cleared his throat again, bringing Captain Chin's attention back to the present. She realized that everyone in the room was waiting, that the moment had arrived when she would need to explain how she had achieved the impossible. Taking a deep breath, she prepared to tell them about the night when everything changed, when she had made the decision that would transform her from a conventional special operations officer into something else entirely. The call sign Specter 6 hadn't been assigned through normal channels. It hadn't appeared on any mission briefing or operational plan. Instead, it had emerged from the darkness of an Afghan valley, whispered among resistance fighters, and eventually adopted by air crews who found themselves taking orders from a voice that seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost, always knowing exactly where the enemy was and exactly what needed to be done. But explaining how she had earned that call sign and why it still sent chills through anyone who had heard it used during those 3 months of operations would require telling them about the night when everything went wrong, and she had been forced to become something that wasn't covered in any military manual or training program. The night that changed everything began like many others during Captain Chen's infiltration. She had been in the valley for 2 weeks, gradually building relationships with local contacts while gathering intelligence on the terrorist compound. Her cover as a relief worker had held up well, allowing her to move freely through the area during daylight hours while conducting reconnaissance after dark. But on this particular night, everything went sideways in a matter of minutes. Captain Chun was returning from a meeting with resistance fighters when she heard the distinctive sound of helicopters approaching from the east. Her heart sank as she realized what was happening. Against all established protocols, someone had authorized a rescue mission without her knowledge or coordination. The operation was doomed from the start. Intelligence reports had clearly indicated that the compound's air defenses were too sophisticated for a conventional helicopter assault. But somewhere up the chain of command, someone had decided they couldn't wait any longer for her mission to produce results. As she watched from a hillside overlooking the valley, Captain Chen saw the lead helicopter disappear in a ball of flame as surface-to-air missiles found their mark. The second helicopter managed to deploy its team before taking heavy fire and crashing into the mountainside. Suddenly, instead of having to rescue 47 hostages, Captain Chen found herself responsible for the lives of 8 special operations soldiers who were now pinned down in hostile territory with no extraction plan and no way to call for help through normal channels. The terrorist response was swift and overwhelming. Within minutes of the helicopters going down, the compound came alive with activity. Vehicles poured out of hidden positions, carrying heavily armed fighters toward the crash sites. Captain Chun could hear automatic weapons fire echoing through the valley as the terrorists moved to surround and eliminate the surviving American forces. From her position on the hillside, Captain Chin faced a choice that would define the rest of her career. She could maintain her cover and continue with the original mission, hoping that the surviving soldiers could escape on their own. Or she could abandon months of careful preparation and reveal herself to save their lives, knowing that doing so would compromise any chance of rescuing the original hostages through covert means. The decision took less than a second. Captain Chun activated her encrypted radio and began transmitting on emergency frequencies, identifying herself with the call sign she had been assigned for the mission, Desert Wind 6. But as she began coordinating with air assets orbiting high above the valley, something unexpected happened. The local resistance fighters who had been working with her suddenly appeared on nearby ridgelines, armed with weapons they had kept hidden throughout her time in the valley. Their leader, a grizzled former Afghan army officer named Commander Rashid, approached her position and spoke words that would haunt her for years afterward. "Tonight you are not Desert Wind 6. Tonight you are Specter 6, the ghost who brings death from the sky." What followed over the next 6 hours redefined modern special operations tactics and demonstrated capabilities that military planners had never imagined possible. Working with a network of local fighters who knew every cave and pathway in the valley, Captain Chun began coordinating a complex series of airstrikes that targeted terrorist positions with surgical precision while avoiding any risk to civilian populations. But this wasn't conventional forward air control. Captain Chun had no direct line of sight to most of the targets, no laser designators, and no advanced targeting equipment. Instead, she was relying on descriptions provided by resistance fighters positioned throughout the valley, combining their local knowledge with her understanding of modern air power to create a new form of battlefield coordination. The first strike came at midnight, when Captain Chun guided a pair of F-18 Hornets to a position where they could eliminate a surface-to-air missile site that was preventing rescue helicopters from approaching the area. Using landmarks described by Commander Rashid's fighters, she talked the pilots through an approach that brought them in below the radar horizon, allowing them to destroy the missile battery with precision-guided munitions. With the immediate air defense threat neutralized, Captain Chun was able to call in a medical evacuation helicopter for the most seriously wounded soldiers from the crashed aircraft. But instead of pulling back after accomplishing this limited objective, she made a decision that surprised everyone monitoring the radio frequencies that night. She announced her intention to continue the mission and rescue all the hostages. The terrorist leadership had assumed that the failed helicopter assault was the extent of American capabilities in the area. They had no idea that a single operator was still active in their territory, coordinating with local resistance forces and calling in airstrikes with devastating accuracy. As dawn approached, Captain Chun began systematically dismantling their defenses, working her way toward the compound where the hostages were being held. Each strike was planned with meticulous care. Captain Chun would receive intelligence from resistance fighters about terrorist movements, analyze the information using her tactical training, and then coordinate with air assets to deliver precisely targeted attacks. She wasn't just calling in airstrikes. She was conducting a complex symphony of destruction that eliminated enemy forces while protecting civilian populations and preserving the underground tunnels where the hostages were being held. The terrorist communications networks were among her first targets. Using intelligence provided by local fighters who had been monitoring their radio traffic, Captain Chun was able to guide airstrikes that destroyed communication centers and isolated the compound from outside support. This had the dual effect of preventing the terrorists from calling for reinforcements while also making it impossible for them to coordinate the execution of hostages. As the sun rose over the valley, the full scope of what Captain Chun had accomplished during the night became clear. Working with resistance fighters she had never met before that evening, using tactics that weren't covered in any military manual, she had eliminated more than half of the terrorist force while suffering minimal casualties among her irregular allies. But the most challenging part of the mission still lay ahead. The hostages were being held in an underground complex that was virtually impossible to assault directly. The tunnels were too narrow for conventional military operations, and any attempt to force entry would result in the immediate execution of the prisoners. Captain Chun needed a different approach, one that would require her to abandon everything she had learned about special operations and improvise using methods that bordered on the impossible. Commander Rashid had been watching her performance throughout the night with growing amazement. He had fought alongside American forces before, but never had he seen anyone coordinate air power with such precision while maintaining perfect situational awareness across an entire valley. When she explained what she needed to accomplish next, he simply nodded and began making preparations for an operation that would have seemed insane to any conventional military planner. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its complexity. Instead of trying to assault the underground complex directly, Captain Chun would use her air assets to create a series of controlled cave-ins that would seal most of the tunnel entrances while leaving only one route open. This would force the terrorists to move all the hostages to a single location, where they could be rescued through a coordinated ground assault. But executing this plan required a level of precision that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with air power. Captain Chun needed to bring down specific sections of tunnel while ensuring that other areas remained intact. She had to coordinate multiple aircraft attacking different targets simultaneously, timing each strike to within seconds to achieve the desired effect. The resistance fighters positioned throughout the valley became her eyes and ears, providing real-time feedback about the effects of each airstrike and helping her adjust targeting to achieve the precise results she needed. It was a form of battlefield coordination that had never been attempted before, combining modern technology with local knowledge in ways that military strategists had never imagined. As the morning progressed, Captain Chun continued to refine her tactics, developing new methods for coordinating air power that would later be studied and adopted by special operations forces around the world. She wasn't just rescuing hostages. She was revolutionizing the way small teams could leverage air support to achieve objectives that would normally require much larger forces. The terrorists trapped in the compound began to realize that they were facing something unprecedented. Their communications were cut, their escape routes were blocked, and an invisible enemy was systematically destroying their defenses with surgical precision. Some tried to flee through mountain paths, only to find resistance fighters waiting in ambush. Others attempted to dig new tunnel exits, but airstrikes would arrive with uncanny timing to collapse their escape routes. By noon, the terrorist leadership found themselves exactly where Captain Chen wanted them, trapped in the deepest section of the underground complex with all 47 hostages, unable to escape and unable to communicate with the outside world. The stage was set for the final phase of an operation that would go down in military history as one of the most audacious rescues ever attempted. But Captain Chen knew that everything accomplished up to this point would be meaningless if she couldn't successfully extract the hostages from their underground prison. The next phase would require her to transition from air power coordination to direct action, working with Commander Rashid's fighters to assault a position that had been designed to be impregnable. As she prepared for the final assault, Captain Chen reflected on how much had changed since the previous evening. She had begun the mission as Desert Wind 6, a conventional special operations officer following established protocols. But somewhere during those 6 hours of coordinating airstrikes and working with resistance fighters, she had become something else entirely. She had become Specter 6, a call sign that would be whispered in briefing rooms for years to come whenever military planners discussed the boundaries of what was possible in modern warfare. The underground complex beneath the terrorist compound was a maze of natural caves connected by hand-dug tunnels that had been carved out over decades. Intelligence reports suggested that the deepest chambers could only be reached through a single narrow passage, making any conventional assault virtually impossible. But Captain Chen wasn't planning a conventional assault. Working with Commander Rashid and his fighters, she had spent the afternoon studying detailed maps of the cave system drawn by local villagers who remembered exploring these passages as children. What emerged from their collective knowledge was a three-dimensional puzzle that revealed hidden connections and forgotten entrances that didn't appear in any terrorist intelligence files. The key breakthrough came when an elderly village woman approached their planning session and quietly mentioned a shepherd's cave that connected to the main complex through a passage so narrow that most adults couldn't fit through it. The terrorists knew about this connection but had dismissed it as unusable for any military purpose. They had posted a single guard at the entrance and largely ignored it. Captain Chen realized immediately that this overlooked passage represented her best chance of success. While the terrorists expected any rescue attempt to come through the main entrances they were heavily defending, a small team could potentially infiltrate through the shepherd's cave and reach the hostages from an unexpected direction. But there was a problem. The passage was indeed too narrow for most adults, and even those who could fit would be crawling single file through complete darkness for nearly half a mile. It would be impossible to carry the weapons and equipment normally required for a hostage rescue operation. Anyone attempting this infiltration would be completely vulnerable if discovered, with no room to maneuver and no way to retreat quickly. Commander Rashid studied the cave diagrams and shook his head. Even if we could reach them, he said, how would we get 47 people out through a passage that barely fits one person at a time? The terrorists would have hours to kill them all while we tried to evacuate them one by one. Captain Chen had been thinking about the same problem, and she believed she had found a solution. But it would require a level of tactical coordination that had never been attempted before, combining simultaneous operations above and below ground with split-second timing that left no room for error. Her plan was audacious in its complexity. While she infiltrated through the shepherd's cave to reach the hostages, Commander Rashid's fighters would launch a diversionary assault on the main entrances to the complex. This would draw the terrorists' attention and hopefully cause them to concentrate their forces at the expected attack points. But the real key to success would come from above. Captain Chen had identified a section of the underground complex where the roof was thin enough that a precisely placed airstrike could create a new opening large enough for rapid evacuation. The timing would have to be perfect, too early, and the terrorists would have time to react and kill the hostages, too late, and Captain Chen would be trapped underground with no way to escape. As evening approached, Captain Chen made her final preparations for what everyone understood might be a one-way mission. She stripped down to the bare minimum equipment, carrying only a sidearm, a radio, and a small amount of explosives that might be useful for creating diversions. Everything else would depend on stealth, surprise, and the hope that her tactical plan would work exactly as designed. The infiltration began at sunset, when the call to prayer would provide cover for any small sounds that might alert the guard at the shepherd's cave entrance. Captain Chun had studied the guard's routine throughout the afternoon and knew that he typically became less vigilant during prayer time, often sitting with his back to the cave entrance while facing toward Mecca. The approach to the cave required crossing nearly 200 yards of open ground that offered minimal cover. Captain Chun moved with the patience of someone who understood that a single mistake would result not only in her own death, but in the execution of 47 innocent people. Every step was calculated, every movement timed to coincide with natural sounds that would mask her presence. Reaching the cave entrance undetected, Captain Chun found the guard exactly where she expected him to be, kneeling in prayer with his rifle set aside. She had hoped to avoid violence at this stage of the operation, but there was no way to pass him without being detected. Using techniques learned in special operations training, she neutralized the guard quickly and silently, then dragged his body into the cave where it wouldn't be discovered. The narrow passage through the mountain was every bit as challenging as the village woman had described. Captain Chun found herself crawling through sections so tight that she had to exhale completely to squeeze through, pushing her equipment ahead of her while navigating in complete darkness. The rock walls pressed against her from all sides, and more than once she wondered if she would become stuck and die slowly in the underground darkness. After what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 45 minutes, Captain Chun emerged into a larger chamber that connected to the main cave system. According to her maps, she was now directly beneath the compound, with the hostage-holding area somewhere ahead through a series of interconnected caves. But she was also deep in enemy territory, with dozens of terrorists between her and her objective. Moving through the underground complex required a completely different set of skills than anything Captain Chun had learned in military training. The caves were not only dark, but filled with acoustic anomalies that made it impossible to determine the direction and distance of sounds. Voices echoed from passages that led nowhere, while footsteps that seemed far away might actually be coming from just around the next corner. Captain Chun relied on the detailed descriptions provided by Commander Rashid's sources to navigate the maze of tunnels. Each branch point was a potential dead end or trap, and every step forward took her deeper into a labyrinth where retreat would become increasingly difficult. She moved with the slow precision of someone who understood that speed without accuracy would be fatal. The first terrorist patrol found her nearly an hour into the underground phase of the operation. Captain Chun heard their voices echoing through the tunnels long before she saw their flashlight beams, giving her time to find a hiding spot in a side passage barely large enough to conceal her body. She pressed herself against the cold rock and controlled her breathing as 3 fighters passed within arm's reach, discussing their plans for executing the hostages if any rescue attempt was detected. Their conversation revealed crucial intelligence about the terrorists' security arrangements. The hostages were indeed being held in the deepest part of the complex, guarded by suicide bombers who had orders to detonate their explosives at the first sign of an assault. The terrorist leadership was so confident in their defenses that they were planning to move some of their forces to other positions, leaving the hostage area with minimal security. Captain Chun realized that this redistribution of enemy forces created a narrow window of opportunity that wouldn't last long. She activated her radio and transmitted a coded message to the air assets orbiting overhead, informing them that the diversionary assault should begin in exactly 30 minutes. That would give her just enough time to reach the hostages and be in position for the coordinated escape attempt. The final approach to the hostage-holding area was the most dangerous part of the entire infiltration. The tunnels narrowed again, forcing Captain Chun to crawl through passages where any sound would echo clearly to guards positioned ahead. She could hear voices speaking in English for the first time since beginning the mission, the voices of American civilians who had been held captive for months. Reaching a position where she could observe the hostage area, Captain Chun found a scene that was both better and worse than she had expected. The 47 Americans were being held in a large natural chamber that would provide good cover during an airstrike, but they were guarded by 6 terrorists, including 2 wearing suicide vests who were positioned to maximize casualties if they detonated their explosives. The timing of what happened next would be discussed in military academies for years afterward. At exactly the moment when Captain Chun was preparing to make her move, Commander Rashid's diversionary assault began at the main entrances to the complex. The sound of explosions and automatic weapons fire echoed through the tunnels, causing immediate confusion among the guards. 4 of the 6 terrorists immediately left their positions to respond to the attack, but the 2 suicide bombers remained with the hostages, their fingers on detonation switches that would kill everyone in the chamber if they suspected a rescue attempt was underway. Captain Shin found herself facing an impossible tactical situation. She could probably eliminate both guards, but not before one of them could trigger an explosion that would kill the very people she was trying to save. The solution came from an unexpected source. One of the American hostages, a State Department official who had been held captive longer than the others, had been quietly observing the guards' routines and had developed a plan of his own. As the sounds of battle grew louder outside, he began having what appeared to be a medical emergency, drawing both suicide bombers away from their positions as they tried to determine whether he was actually dying or attempting some kind of deception. Captain Chun seized the opportunity created by this distraction, moving with a speed and precision that reflected years of specialized training. She eliminated both suicide bombers before either could reach for their detonation switches, then quickly identified herself to the hostages and began organizing them for the evacuation that would begin in less than 2 minutes. The Americans had endured months of captivity, and many were in poor physical condition, but they responded to Captain Chin's instructions with the discipline of people who understood that their survival depended on following orders exactly. She arranged them in groups that could move efficiently through the underground passages while ensuring that the weakest would be evacuated first when the airstrike created their escape route. As the final seconds ticked down toward the coordinated airstrike, Captain Chin found herself in the surreal position of standing in an underground chamber with 47 rescued hostages, knowing that in moments the ceiling above them would be blown apart by American bombs. Everything would depend on the precision of pilots she had never met, guided by coordinates she had calculated using maps drawn by village children who had explored these caves decades earlier. The explosion, when it came, was unlike anything Captain Chun had ever experienced. The entire mountain seemed to shake as precision-guided munitions punched through rock and earth to create an opening that was exactly the right size for rapid evacuation. Dust and debris filled the chamber, but when it cleared, a shaft of daylight was visible overhead, along with the ropes that Commander Rashid's fighters had immediately dropped for the evacuation. What followed was organized chaos as 47 Americans who had given up hope of ever seeing home again suddenly found themselves climbing toward freedom through a hole that had been blown in a mountain by their own military forces. Captain Chun remained in the chamber until the last hostage had been evacuated, then climbed out herself to find that the battle above ground was still raging as terrorist forces tried to prevent the rescue from succeeding. Emerging from the underground complex into the chaos of an active battlefield, Captain Chin found herself in a situation that no military training manual had ever covered. 47 rescued American hostages were scattered across a mountaintop in Afghanistan, with terrorist forces converging from multiple directions and extraction helicopters still minutes away from reaching the improvised landing zone. Commander Rashid's fighters had performed brilliantly during the diversionary assault, but they were running low on ammunition and taking casualties as increasing numbers of terrorists responded to the sounds of battle. The original plan had called for a quick extraction, but the reality of moving 47 civilians across hostile terrain while under fire was proving far more complex than anyone had anticipated. Captain Chin quickly assessed the tactical situation and realized that conventional extraction procedures weren't going to work. The hostages were in various states of physical condition after months of captivity, some requiring medical attention that couldn't wait for evacuation to a military hospital. The improvised landing zone was under direct observation by terrorist forces positioned on nearby ridgelines, making it impossible for helicopters to land safely without first eliminating those positions. Working with Commander Rashid, Captain Chin began implementing a new plan that combined elements of conventional military tactics with improvisational methods that were being created in real time. She divided the rescued hostages into groups based on their physical condition and mobility, then assigned resistance fighters to guide each group, toward multiple extraction points that would be more difficult for the terrorists to target simultaneously. But the key to success would once again come from the air. Captain Chun resumed her role as forward air controller, coordinating with aircraft overhead to provide close air support for the evacuation. However, this time she was operating under even more challenging conditions, calling in airstrikes while moving across hostile terrain with a group of civilians who had never experienced combat. The next 2 hours represented some of the most intense fighting of Captain Chen's career. Working with obsolete maps and relying on descriptions provided by local fighters, she guided a series of precision airstrikes that systematically eliminated terrorist positions while creating safe corridors for the evacuating hostages. Each strike had to be planned around the movement of friendly forces, requiring a level of coordination that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The first extraction helicopter arrived just as terrorist reinforcements were beginning to converge on their position from the valley below. Captain Chen found herself directing air traffic while simultaneously coordinating ground movements, ensuring that each helicopter could land, load evacuees, and depart before coming under effective enemy fire. She had become a battlefield conductor, orchestrating a complex symphony of air and ground forces with life-or-death precision. As the evacuation progressed, something unexpected began happening among Commander Rashid's fighters. Word was spreading through their ranks about the American woman who had coordinated the underground rescue and was now calling in airstrikes with impossible accuracy while moving with them across the battlefield. They began referring to her as Specter 6, even during radio communications, and the call sign was quickly adopted by the air crews supporting the operation. The name carried deeper meaning than Captain Chen realized at the time. In local folklore, specters were spirits who appeared in times of great need to protect the innocent and punish the wicked. To the resistance fighters who had spent years fighting against overwhelming odds, Captain Chen's ability to materialize death from the sky while remaining essentially invisible to enemy forces seemed to embody everything their legends had promised. By late afternoon, 39 of the 47 hostages had been successfully evacuated, but the remaining 8 presented unique challenges. They included 2 State Department officials who were too valuable for the terrorists to give up easily, and 6 aid workers who had been held in a separate location and were only discovered during the evacuation. Extracting these final hostages would require another underground infiltration, this time under conditions far more dangerous than the morning's operation. Captain Chun made the decision that would define the final phase of Operation Desert Wind. Rather than waiting for conventional reinforcements that might take hours to arrive, she chose to return to the cave system with a small team of Commander Rashid's most experienced fighters. They would attempt to reach the remaining hostages using the same methods that had proved successful earlier, but this time the terrorists would be expecting them. The second underground operation began at sunset, with Captain Chun and for resistance fighters infiltrating through a different cave entrance that local sources believed connected to the section where the final hostages were being held. But the conditions were drastically different from the morning's mission. The terrorists had flooded the tunnels with additional guards, and they had brought in tracking dogs that made silent movement virtually impossible. Captain Chun found herself adapting her tactics once again, using techniques that combined special operations training with lessons learned from Commander Rashid's fighters about underground warfare in mountainous terrain. They moved through passages filled with smoke from fires that the terrorists had lit to flush out any infiltrators, navigating by feel through sections where visibility was zero. The final firefight of Operation Desert Wind took place in an underground chamber lit only by muzzle flashes and the flickering flames of improvised torches. Captain Chun and her team found themselves outnumbered 3-1, fighting in conditions where conventional tactics were useless and survival depended on instinct and improvisation. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed through stone tunnels, creating acoustic confusion that made it impossible to determine the direction of threats. But Captain Chun had one final card to play. Throughout the underground battle, she maintained radio contact with air assets overhead, and she had calculated that a precisely placed airstrike could collapse a section of tunnel that would trap the remaining terrorists while leaving the final 8 hostages unharmed. It was an incredibly risky maneuver that required perfect timing and absolute trust in the abilities of pilots who couldn't see their target. The strike came just as Captain Chun and her team were running out of ammunition and defensive positions. The mountain shook as bombs penetrated through layers of rock to collapse the tunnel section exactly as planned, sealing off the terrorist forces while creating a new escape route for the final hostages. In a matter of minutes, what had seemed like an impossible tactical situation was transformed into a successful rescue operation. The evacuation of the final 8 hostages proceeded smoothly, with extraction helicopters arriving exactly when expected and departing without incident. As Captain Chun climbed aboard the last helicopter to leave the area, she found herself looking back at a valley that had been forever changed by the events of the past 24 hours. The terrorist compound was in ruins, their leadership was eliminated or scattered, and 47 American lives had been saved through an operation that had redefined what was possible in modern warfare. Months later, sitting in the Pentagon briefing room, Captain Chin finished her account of Operation Desert Wind as General Morrison and the assembled officers sat in stunned silence. The story she had just told challenged everything they thought they knew about special operations, air power, and the capabilities of individual operators working with local forces. General Morrison finally broke the silence by asking the question that everyone in the room was thinking. Captain Chun, during the operation, air crews reported receiving instructions from someone using the call sign Specter 6. Can you explain how that designation came to be used? Captain Chun looked around the room at faces that reflected a mixture of amazement and disbelief. These were senior military officers who had seen combat, who understood the complexities of modern warfare, but what they had just heard seemed to stretch the boundaries of what was possible for a single operator to accomplish. The story of how she became Specter 6 wasn't something that could be explained through conventional military terminology. It involved tactics that weren't covered in any manual, partnerships with local forces that went beyond normal liaison relationships, and a level of tactical improvisation that bordered on the supernatural. More importantly, it represented a fundamental shift in how small teams could leverage modern technology and local knowledge to achieve objectives that would normally require much larger forces. As Captain Chun prepared to explain the significance of the Specter 6 call sign, she realized that she was describing more than just a successful military operation. She was explaining how modern warfare was evolving, how the combination of advanced technology and human adaptability was creating new possibilities for small unit operations, and how individual initiative could overcome apparently impossible odds when guided by proper tactical thinking. The room remained silent as she began to speak, everyone understanding that they were about to hear the conclusion of a story that would influence military planning for years to come. The call sign Specter 6 had been born in an Afghan valley during a night when everything went wrong, but it had evolved into something that represented the future of special operations warfare. The call sign came from Commander Rashid's fighters, Captain Chun said finally. To them, I wasn't just another American soldier. I was someone who could appear and disappear like a ghost, bringing death from the sky while remaining invisible to enemy forces. They called me Specter 6 because I had become something that existed between their world and mine, between conventional military operations and something else entirely. She paused, looking around the room at officers who were still processing everything they had heard. But the real significance of Specter 6 isn't about one operation or one person. It's about what becomes possible when we stop thinking about warfare in terms of conventional limitations and start thinking about how to combine all available resources, air power, local knowledge, individual initiative, and advanced communications, into something greater than the sum of its parts. General Morrison nodded slowly, understanding that the briefing he had just heard would require fundamental changes in how the military trained and equipped its special operations forces. The tactics that Captain Chun had developed during Operation Desert Wind couldn't be taught through normal channels, but they represented capabilities that future operations would require. As the meeting concluded and officers began filing out of the briefing room, Captain Chun reflected on how much her life had changed since that night in Afghanistan when she first heard someone call her Specter 6. The name had followed her through subsequent operations, appearing in classified reports and whispered conversations among special operations personnel who understood what it represented. But more than personal recognition, The story of Specter 6 had become a testament to what was possible when individual courage combined with tactical innovation and local partnerships. It represented a new model for special operations that would influence military planning for decades to come, proving that sometimes the most impossible missions could be accomplished by someone willing to become something that wasn't covered in any manual or training program. The legend of Specter 6 would live on in military folklore, inspiring future generations of special operations personnel, while serving as a reminder that warfare's most significant innovations often came not from advanced technology or overwhelming force, but from individual soldiers who were willing to adapt, improvise, and become whatever their mission required them to be.